All right, so moving on now then into the second lecture of Rudolf Steiner's lecture cycle here, the principle of spiritual economy. And I've just randomly grabbed one of his blackboard drawings here. I'm not sure what it is. It says Geistvater or Spirit Father and Stoffmutter or Earth Mother, I suppose. But nonetheless, it's a good sort of illustration illustrating the penetration of the Christ's being into the Earth's astral plane, which is sort of what this chapter is about, sort of a condensed astral history of Christianity. So first he starts by saying, by differentiating this concept that probably was not very well known in 1909 when he was giving these lectures, of an avatar. This idea that has been imported from the East. He says there are certain beings in the evolution of the earth who have incarnated as avatars. They are higher beings, and they have chosen to selflessly incarnate in order to help the progress of humanity. Human beings only take from the earth. They never give to it. But avatars come down and give to it and make new spiritual things possible. So we have this idea of the avatar. And he gives, the first example that he gives is, let's take the avatar of Shem. We have the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And traditionally, Shem is the father of the Semites, so that accounts for the continent of Asia. I guess Mongolians were not included in that model. So, and then the Hamites, of course, then become the Africans, and then Europe is Japheth. Or Yaptos in Greek myth, that becomes Europe. So we have Shem, and he says, so Shem is the father, in a way, of all the Hebrews who follow. This is even before Abraham. And he says that, so now what has happened here is that Shem, as an avatar, was woven into the etheric body, or an avataric being. He doesn't name what the avataric being is. He says an avataric being has been woven within the etheric body of Shem. Woven within, not the ego, not the astral body, but specifically the etheric body. And when an avatar does this, descends into a person's etheric body, or any part of it, could be the ego, as the Christ being does of Jesus of Nazareth, it makes possible the multiplication and copies of that etheric body. And so all subsequent Hebrews, as this passes down through the bloodline, have received, woven within their own etheric bodies, a copy of the etheric body of Shem. Because the presence of an avatar has come down, it makes possible the multiplication, by means of the principle of spiritual economy, the multiplication of an etheric body for an entire people, in this case, the Hebrews. But now he says that with the Christ avatar, we have something different. With the Christ avatar, we have a much greater avatar, the Christ, who is a being who has come down from the sun. He was one of the what are called the powers, that the angelic hierarchy of the powers, who are associated with the sun, comes down and enters into the ego of Jesus of Nazareth when he is 30 years old, and at the moment that he is baptized by John, and the dove descends. The descent of that dove is symbolic of the Christ being descending down into the ego of Jesus of Nazareth. Later in the fifth gospel, he'll say that the ego of Zarathustra had been there and now left and went into the astral plane and was replaced by the avatar of the Christ. Not just the ego, but the avatar of this Christ being that came into him. So now what has been made possible is the multiplication of copies of Christ's etheric body, and also the multiplication of copies of his astral body. And they don't have to be inherited through the bloodline, as it was with the Hebrews. So he looks at Christian history in a kind of sense as it moves through three phases: a physical phase, an etheric phase, and an astral phase. And he says that with regard to the physical phase of Christianity, we have the passing on of knowledge of Christ's deeds through witnesses, who then pass that knowledge on, and so forth. So we have, for instance, Peter who was there with Christ, witnessed everything firsthand. In an interview with Mark, Mark writes the first gospel. So Mark's gospel is the oldest and presumably the most authentic. It's written like 65 AD, something like that. So Peter has firsthand knowledge and he passes it to Mark. So we have the Mark gospel, which I think is the most authentic and the best anyway. And then that then gets passed. So then the apostles, the other apostles as well, they all have disciples too. In the Acts of the Apostles, you can see this. They all have disciples too. So those disciples hear firsthand this knowledge, and it gets passed along. It's passed along to Bishop Irenaeus, for example, who was born in, I think, 125 AD, and who's one of the first to try and systematize and dogmatize Christianity. And Bishop Papias, also in the same century, who claimed to have sat at the foot of the disciples of the apostles. So we have this emphasis on physical hearing of the actual events that were associated with Christ. So this is sort of the physical phase of the development of Christianity. But then he says, after about the time of Augustine, this starts to come to an end. And what happens is, from the 5th century down to the 12th century, we have a shift into the etheric phase of Christianity, whereby Christ's etheric body now, copies of Christ's etheric body are multiplied to individuals now who gain an almost intuitive understanding of Christianity because they have copies of Christ's etheric body, Jesus of Nazareth's etheric body woven into their own etheric bodies. And so we have individuals like the anonymous author of the German gospel, which really should be a fifth gospel called the Heliant, dating from about 800, and it's an Anglo-Saxon Germanic gospel that is a retelling by an anonymous individual of the four gospels. He obviously knows them because as the Heliant opens up, he's talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So he knows them, he's read them, but then he proceeds to write a German version of the gospels in which he turns Christ into a tribal warlord with the apostles as his vassals. And it's set in a German setting. It's really interesting. It is actually kind of a fifth gospel. It's different from the original four, but recounts basically the same events. Steiner's own gospel then should actually be called the sixth gospel. So he says it enabled this individual to having Christ's a copy of his etheric body woven into his own to do this, and other individuals who are able to do this as well during this whole period here. But he says that something is different by the time of the 12th century. So we get the 12th century in which copies now of Christ's astral body are now woven into the astral bodies of specific individuals. And so the astral body differs from the etheric body in that the etheric body is passionless. You just think of plants. They only have etheric bodies, and they have no passion whatsoever. They just grow. They have sap flowing through them. But the astral body contains passions, strong feelings, aggression, jealousy, anger, desire. All of that kind of stuff comes out of the astral body. But at first, so now we also have Steiner's threefold distinction with regard to the soul, which is the same as the ego for him, where we have a sentient soul, an intellectual soul, and a consciousness soul. The sentient soul simply has to do with the senses, the way in which an ego perceives the world by means of an astral body, because the astral body has to be there to give it waking consciousness, and then it has the five senses to perceive. The physical exteriorization of the astral body is the nervous system, and then the senses are the physical exteriorization of the sentient soul. So that gets activated first. Christ's astral body and his sentient soul gets woven into the astral sentient souls of individuals like St. Francis of Assisi, who is an individual who has the series of deeds that happen. He hears the voice of God warning him against joining the Fourth Crusade to go to Byzantium and shamelessly pillage the place, which is exactly what the Fourth Crusade did. And then, so he listens to the voice of God. He says, no, never mind. Goes back. And then he finds a church that's it's sort of in ruins. It's on its way out. and he hears the voice of God tell him to repair the church, find a means of doing it. So he steals money. He steals money from this guy. I forgot who the guy is. And the guy to rebuild this church, and the guy takes him to court and sues him. But the church does get rebuilt. And Francis then goes on a life of poverty, wandering through the streets, almost like a sannyasin in India, just a beggar, a wanderer. A life of poverty, chastity, and charity. Care for. This is a very highly evolved individual, St. Francis was. These are higher evolved humans that are nearing the ends of their incarnational process, because once they have gone through all of their whatever thousands of lifetimes that it takes to process all these virtues and difficult tasks and tests, such as learning compassion, learning about self-restraint, like in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the solution that he gives to the wasteland of a raw animal human existence is give, sympathize, and control. Give, be munificent, be generous, sympathize, and also empathize with the suffering and plight of other people. Compassion and control, self-control. That's basically what more highly evolved individuals do, like St. Francis, and also Elizabeth of Thuringia, who became a Franciscan, lived about the same time as St. Francis. Her husband died, and then she made a vow to become a nun. She founded one of the first hospitals and devoted her life to sort of physical deeds. These are the emphasis on the sentient soul with the astral body is an emphasis on the physical. These individuals are doing physical things. Whereas now with the scholastics that come in, and by the way, there has been a rumor amongst anthroposophists that Rudolf Steiner is the reincarnation of St. Thomas of Aquinas, but also of Aristotle. Now, yesterday I talked to a medium, and I asked the medium to relay this question to the spirits. And the spirits said, no, he was not Aristotle, but he was a direct pupil of Aristotle. So he inherited the Aristotelian tradition and passed it along. But yes, he was St. Thomas Aquinas. So the spirits clarified that for us. So with the scholastics who come in right around the 12th century now, 13th century and so forth, we get the intellectual soul of Christ being woven in, the intellectual astral soul of Christ being woven into the intellectual souls of these individuals. And now we get scholasticism, this explosion of Aristotelian conceptual thinking, the attempt to reconcile reason with revelation, which was Aquinas' central task, and so forth. So we get that. Then the consciousness soul, which is the third aspect of the ego for Rudolf Steiner, which is really the ego itself, because the consciousness soul is the seat of I will, my free will. I will something through the use of my free will, which involves then my ego. So then we get individuals like Meister Eckhart, the mystic Meister Eckhart, and his pupil Johannes Tauler, who identify Christ within themselves, actually. They say, the Christ lives within me. But it also, though, now begins to develop the ego of Christianity. So we've seen the development of its physical body, the development of its etheric body, and the development of its astral body. Now at this point we have, starting from the 15th century, the development of its ego. So we get natural science coming in. We get Giordano Bruno, we get Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Tycho Brahe. All these people come in and start laying out the foundations, and especially Newton in the 17th century, the foundations of natural science, which Steiner says then divorces the ego now from Christianity. Christianity begins to be discussed and debated about. You get Calvinists, you get the Protestant outbreak with Calvinism and Lutheranism and Zwingli, all debating. And of course, once something happens like that, and he makes this point, it's absolutely correct. Once you start having to analyze a mythology or a theology, it's over. That mythology is dead, because now the intellect comes in, the intellectual soul comes in and analyzes it, because it's not being lived anymore. It's not just taken for granted as something that you naturally do and live. question the existence of God or what the meaning of the Last Supper is. We all know what the meaning of the Last Supper is. It's that you identify that Christ has become the planetary spirit of the earth through bread and wine. That's what it has always meant, and always meant up to this point. Wheat is the bread, and that becomes his body. And the sap that flows through plants, especially the vine, becomes his blood. And he is the planetary spirit. That's what the statement that he's making there during the Last Supper. But during the Protestant outbreak, all this becomes analyzed and debated, so it's dead. It starts to disintegrate. So we get materialism then coming in. So he says modern natural science, and by this he means in the time that he's living, in 1909 here, modern natural science is the ultimate outcome of scholasticism. The only way they even have the ability to think with conceptual language to analyze the external physical world was precisely because the medieval mystics of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries developed the intellectual soul, intellectual thinking. They may have been mystical in their feeling for Christianity, but the thinking was intellectual, conceptual. And natural science wouldn't even exist without the spiritual science, as he calls it, of the Middle Ages, the medieval period. And so he says now what needs to happen is that with regard to the ego, in a way it needs to be transubstantiated now, the ego of Christianity, and made receptive to the Christ spirit, the Christ principle, so that the ego can perform work on the astral body to bring about the manas, what he calls the manas, which is the spirit self, which is the harnessing of the forces of passions and desires and impulses and so forth of the astral body. Those become tamed and mastered through self-control, through egoic practices in meditation, prayer, what have you, to eventually, as he says elsewhere, in the sixth great cultural epoch, the one that will follow this one, that belongs to the Russians, he says, to develop the spirit self, the manas. So that this will be the Christian spirit self, which will then, in the next epoch, develop into the Christian life spirit, and then eventually, finally, the work on the physical body. The life spirit comes from the ego's work on the etheric body. The ego's work on the physical body will then transubstantiate it into the spirit body of Christianity, as he says, the ultimate star toward which we are all going. Which is fascinating to me because it sounds a lot like Taylor Deschardins' omega point, which he says the omega point is the ultimate telos that is drawing all of cosmic evolution, cosmic genesis as he calls it, toward it. So I find that interesting, the similarities there. All right, that's this wonderful chapter of the Principle of Spiritual Economy.